If you're looking for wealth, Africa has it. By 2030, private wealth on the continent will have grown 30% to $2.6 trillion, and the amount of ultra-high net worth individuals will have grown by a similar rate. Therefore, the race is on by banks to not only grab those clients, but keep them as well. And Africa's largest bank by assets, Standard Bank, isn't standing idly by. This is Africa Pulse. I'm Bronwyn Seaborn, and on this episode, we discuss private wealth. That's right, you're watching Africa Pulse here on Business Day TV, and today we're delving into private wealth on the continent. And for that discussion, I'm joined by Chiko Manokore, Head of Personal Private Banking for South Africa and Africa at Standard Bank. Chiko, thanks so much for your time today and for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Pleasure to be here.
So situate us right at the top of this discussion. How does Africa stack up against its global peers in terms of private wealth and high net worth individuals?
So when you consider Africa in terms of just sheer numbers, so in Africa broadly, we've got about 135 to 140,000 what we call dollar millionaires. When you consider the rest of the world, that number is close to about 60 million. So from a composition perspective, we're very small in terms of our contribution to overall dollar millionaires. However, it's not all bad news because in the next decade, we do anticipate that number growing by about 60 to 70%, which is significant, and possibly the fastest growing broadly in the globe. The other part is this is historical in nature. So when you think about industrial eras, when you think about how it is that African economies have grown over the last 20, 30 years, many African countries only got independence in the last 30 to 60 years. So a lot of Africans are what we call in first generation wealth phase. So a lot of it is building wealth. You have a significant amount of millionaires who are based in South Africa or South African. Actually, in South Africa, it's about half of that entire proportion. So we don't stack up incredibly well, but however, I think globally we will grow faster than many other parts of the world in terms of that. And that's just simply because of the opportunities that exist on the continent going forward.
Given what you've outlined, how competitive is the landscape for banks? Is it rough out there? Are you fighting each other for clients?
Yeah, it is incredibly aggressive out there. So whether you're in South Africa, whether you're in Nigeria, ideally the banking industry has dialed up a notch, and actually to the extent where many banks are going beyond banking. So you'll find banks getting into, you know the climate situation, for example. So a lot of banks are getting into things like solar. We are in solar, for example, what we call beyond banking. You think of loyalty. Things like that, untraditionally, if you go back 20 years, no bank did some of those things. So ideally, it's how do you create value for clients, where we see the biggest opportunity. But yeah, it is incredibly aggressive. And the small piece of the pie that I think exists in many of the countries, many of the banks essentially want a piece of that.
What levers do you then pull to not only attract but keep those clients, which is particularly important as well?
I think the major area there is around creating value. And when I talk creating value, many of the African markets have relatively undeveloped, if I call it wealth management type capabilities. So the ability to make an individual wealthier than what they are today, or to protect their wealth. That is a big part that we've invested quite a bit in. And I'm sure at some stage we'll get to talk about it, but it's how do you create value for a client to ensure that generations that come are able to still be able to leverage the wealth and be able to get to a point where they can get further than what their previous generations have. We believe strongly as a bank that every generation must be better than the last. And that's an incredibly important piece for us.
What role does technology play in all of this? Because you'd imagine as a high net worth individual, you want all the cool stuff, right? You want the nice app. You want to be able to check on your portfolio. So how crucial is technology when you're approaching the offering that you're presenting to clients?
Us and many other banks use technology to integrate all the various capabilities that we've got. So where you'd have a traditional banking app, nowadays you can access much more through our app. So whether you talk investments, whether you talk insurance, whether you talk all the other, even advice around how do you enable even a virtual call with an advisor. A couple of years ago, that wouldn't have been a thing. So technology is critical in essentially this. And if this market grows, which it will, you want to get to a point where you can serve more customers, and you can actually only do that through technology.
Is private banking just for high net worth individuals? Because I think there largely is this perception out there that if I don't earn a certain amount, I cannot access this.
Private banking is absolutely not for only high net worth type individuals. So we think of private banking in a bit of a continuum. So a client in a South Africa, I'm going to give South African context. A client who's earning about 35 to 40,000 Rand is in what we call a building phase. So if you think about it, the first time you're able to afford property rights for the very first time, to the point at which you are now investing at the top end with highly structured type solutions. You have to be there for a client along the journey, and a little less around, the cutoff point between this group of clients and that group of clients is this amount of money. We'd rather think about it as how a client is starting to behave, because you could be younger, you could be older, you could have had wealth, you could have had no wealth whatsoever, you could be educated, you could be in a corporate entity, you also could be an entrepreneur. It's various walks of life to be able to create an opportunity for them to leverage some of the banking capabilities and other to be able to create some sort of wealth for themselves. So we see it as a continuum as opposed to certain earning capacity, which I think generally you will see in the market tends to be a cutoff at a particular point. Of course they're there, but for us it's about the journey. That's the most important part.
Because it's a difficult one to play, right? You need to have some kind of prestige attached to it, yet you do want to level the playing fields to an extent, because by doing that you increase your client pool.
Correct. So, and that's you, a young person. I mean, I was a lot younger once upon a time, and you've grown. So you've been able to amass different types of wealth. You've been able to amass property, investments, and so on and so forth. But at first, when you start working, for example, when you open a company for the very first time, it isn't that way. One of the things we pride ourselves is being there during the journey and having the opportunity to have the product solutions and otherwise to be able to enable someone to get to the next level.
Let's drill into some of the specifics now. Standard Bank is Africa's largest bank by assets, so you have a large presence on the continent. When it comes to private wealth, though, where's your focus?
So there's some countries that we think are very key and have massive opportunities coming up in the next couple of years. There are countries, for example, that have found a huge amount of minerals, energy capability, and so on and so forth. We want to be there for the growth of those countries, not only as a corporate entity, for example, but as the individual, because sometimes you can't actually tear them apart from one another. But a lot of those countries, so there's Southern African countries where we're quite dominant actually. And I think where we are in the broader continent, we're one of the few banks that are actually in so many countries. So 14 countries, and then you've got an offshore entity as well. How do you get those to work together in such a way that you capitalize on those opportunities? Whether it's people coming into Africa or Africans moving out of the continent for opportunities, you want to be there for the various bits and pieces that appear in all of these countries. So there's no particular country where we have focus in, but there are some big ones where we have high concentrations of private wealth type clients or private banking type clients where we want to pay a particular attention to.
I'd assume South Africa being one of them, the country is home to twice as many high net worth individuals as any other country in Africa. But that's also speaking to the competitive nature or the competitive market that you face here in South Africa. How are you rating your muscle in South Africa specifically to gain and retain market share?
So I think we rate ourselves very highly. So if you consider our dominance, for example, in home loans, we're definitely the leader in terms of that space. There are also areas where, and because we've been there for many customers, so if you think of 1 in every 3 households, naturally we would have participated in essentially helping people get that home loan. We rate ourselves very strongly. I think there's obviously competition. But I do think there's opportunities to grow from where we currently are. I think as an established brand in this market, I think we've got good correlation with people in this, call it affluent type segment. I think it's definitely something that we can leverage as well as the relationships we have in the market to be able to get to that outcome.
How nuanced does your approach become when you go into all these countries? You know, a specific South African approach, not necessarily one that would work in Nigeria or Uganda, right?
Yeah, as they say, Africa is not for the faint-hearted. Every country is incredibly different. However, you'll be amazed that when you talk about wealth or private wealth, there's actually very big similarities between the types of things customers want. So we're very comfortable that the capabilities that we have as an organization can be replicated many times in many countries. But we're also quite confident that our understanding of those countries over the last 160 plus years has given us the legitimacy to be able to grow in this particular space.
You spoke about countries in Africa where they're expected to grow due to whatever's happening in their economy. Immediately, that comes front of mind for me is Namibia, due to the oil and gas discoveries that are being made there. Does Namibia stand out for you then as a country that deserves more focus in terms of your approach, in terms of what you're going to offer there?
We've always had very good dominance in Namibia. We've been there over 100 years already. And I think just the general brand is well accepted in the market, not only at a corporate entity, business entity, as well as personal and private bank. So yes, absolutely, it was one of those countries where we will pay particular additional focus because just the discoveries in the last couple of years make it one of those crown jewels possibly of Southern Africa.
Chiko, as we wrap up then, how do you support clients in making sure that they become wealthier throughout this journey, as you like to call it?
So when we consider wealth or growth, it's actually about how do you enable a customer to do essentially what they consider growth. So whether it's their first property, whether it's investing. So if you think about it, the knowledge that we have in many of our, including in South Africa, is many people don't know if you invested 36,000 in terms of tax-free savings every year for many years, that would end up as millions of rands. It's not as complicated of hundreds of thousands of rand, but it's how do you enable a customer to be able to get that. So we have the largest advisory force in South Africa today, and we've built that deliberately because we ultimately want to get to the point where we're able to advise customers to make the right decisions with what they currently have as wealth to be able to create a better future for them tomorrow.
On that note, Chiko, let's leave it there. Thanks so much for your time today and for joining us here on Africa Pulse. Chiko Manokore is Head of Personal Private Banking for South Africa and Africa at Standard Bank. And that's it from us here at Africa Pulse. Be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place, with more stories from Africa.